In July of 2021, a man from Plano, Texas was arrested for operating a website in which he bought and sold personal usage amounts of marijuana. Now, this guy actually did the packaging and distribution of the narcotics. He would have them delivered by mail carrier, and when he was arrested and convicted of drug trafficking, he was given 6 years in prison. So the question I want us to ask today is, why is it then, in 2013, when a 29-year-old kid who created the exact same type of website, but there is no evidence at all that he had any hand in the exchange of drug paraphernalia, with no priors, convicted of a nonviolent crime, would end up with 2 life sentences plus 40 years? This is the untold story of Ross Ulbricht, the Dread Pirate Roberts, and the Silk Road.
This call is from a federal prison.
I want you to understand what it means to lose your freedom.
29-year-old Ross William Ulbricht, a.k.a. Dread Pirate Robert.
I am not the Dread Pirate Roberts.
Operating a sophisticated illegal drug website.
I inherited the ship from the previous Dread Pirate Roberts, just as you would inherit it from me.
The FBI spent 2 years trying to find the man behind the site.
The man I inherited it from was not the real Dread Pirate Roberts either. Let me explain. The name was the important thing in inspiring the necessary fear. You see, no one can surrender to the Dread Pirate.
Ross Ulbricht, I'll finally leave prison, but I'll be in a body bag.
Welcome to episode 2 of the Reverend and the Reprobate Investigates.
Boy, that quote hits hard, too.
The one at the end?
Yeah. When he leaves prison, it's going to be in a body bag. 2 life sentences plus 40 years, which he's currently serving.
This is episode 2, the story of Duryagan. So we've already established, if you listen to episode 1, what the Silk Road is, who Ross Ulbricht is. But to recap for those of you who are catching up here in episode 2, in 2011, Ross Ulbricht, who was a 26-year-old ideologue, started a website called The Silk Road as a way to circumvent traditional means of commerce. Mm-hmm. It was essentially, in the most basic terms, a black market. Mm-hmm. But it was also a free and open market. Anybody could participate. You could exchange anything, and it was governed by one rule known as the non-aggression principle. We can freely exchange things as two consenting adults as long as it does not harm a third party. Meaning there were no murder for hire schemes, meaning that there was nothing...
human trafficking.
Yeah, no human trafficking, no child pornography. Anything that would harm a third party was not allowed on the Silk Road. And it was adamantly policed by the admins. And where we pick up...
In fact, it was proven in court.
Right.
Because I'm sorry for interrupting, but the media ran with some of that. The right. Murder for hire and all of that was disproven in court. So
and those are really important things for us to point
Probably
out.
Later.
Because as we said in the last episode, this story has been told a few times on a few different podcasts. But the point of view that it's always been taken from is what the news story said. Mm-hmm. The tack that we're taking on it, the approach that we're coming from, is the public record.
Yep.
What was actually said and done in the courts about this? What's the evidence that ended up in the courtroom? And more importantly, as we get on with this, what's the evidence that was withheld from the courtroom that led to the conviction of Ross Ulbricht? So when we pick up from last week, Ross, in November of 2011, after running the site for several months, creating the site, seeing it go from a few hundred users then to a few thousand after Gawker publishes their article about the Silk Road in June of 2011, Ross decides that it's getting out of hand in such a way that it's too much for him to be able to manage. And so after chatting with an anonymous source who spoke with Forbes magazine in August of 2013, he passes the torch to a man that he doesn't know, a person he doesn't know, an entity that says that they are able to fix all of the issues that Ross is having with the Bitcoin wallets. Mm-hmm. Bitcoin was the primary currency that was used on the Silk Road. It's an untraceable, undetectable cryptocurrency, which is completely decentralized from any government.
It helped him serve the idea of a free market, open market, untraceable market that would give privacy to its users.
Absolutely. Anonymity was one of the names of the game. And so in February of 2012, a few months after Ross turns over the Silk Road, the username and the primary admin starts going by the username Dread Pirate Roberts, who, if you've seen The Princess Bride, you know, is a character that has their lineage passed down from person to person to person. The way it operated was the Dread Pirate Roberts would run a piracy operation, then he would find somebody on the ship that he was going to pass the name down to. They would go to port, switch identities, bring on a whole new crew. The new person would become the Dread Pirate Roberts. The other person would serve as the first mate, so that the Dread Pirate Roberts and his legend could live into perpetuity. It was the name that really mattered, because if you came up on somebody as the Dread Pirate Roberts, you would have an immediate surrender, so that there was 100 years lineage of the Dread Pirate Roberts to continue to strike fear into the hearts of those which he came upon. So it's interesting that they would pick this name.
Mm-hmm. It's very clever.
It is, and it is symbolic of a person who's perpetually passing the torch. Now, one of the things that's claimed in court is that the Dread Pirate Roberts was several different people. Mm-hmm. And while DPR, he'll be known as from here on out, is a pivotal character in it, who we're going to focus on today is the Homeland Security agent in Chicago, who in June of 2011, now he won't say exactly how he got tipped off to these packages, but in June of 2011, as he is working as Homeland Security, this sterling agent,
Jared
Deryagan, again, it's Derghiayan, it's pronounced Deryagan as best as we can tell, starts to uncover these packages. Mm-hmm. And in these packages, what he's finding is DVD boxes and children's toys and things like that. And as he begins to unwrap the packages, what they're actually stuffed with is personal use amounts of narcotics, primarily marijuana, but that's not all that was in these packages. And so as he starts to investigate where it is that these packages are coming from, it leads him to the Silk Road. Now, Deryagan won't say exactly what it is that led him to start investigating some of these packages, nor will he give credit to any of the other specific agents that were a part of it. This is one of the parts of this story that's shrouded in a little bit of mystery. Like, was this a by chance thing? Was there an open package that began? How many packages did they open, which would be against federal law? Mm-hmm. There were suspicious packages that ended up being nothing, that, ended up in grandma not getting, her birthday card, or, somebody not getting a Christmas gift or a birthday gift or something that was sent to them.
Maybe that's what happened to my cigars.
Yeah, there you go. But they end up somewhere in these facilities of damaged packages because Homeland Security's opened them. Now, there is a certain amount of, it's within the rights of the government in order to be able to do that as the laws are written, if they believe that there's probable cause, and on and on and on and on and on. Mm-hmm. How Deryagan came about these packages, we don't know. How he was specifically able to trace them back to the Silk Road, we don't know. All of that is kind of mixed into the investigation. But there's a reason that people like Deryagan are put in those positions, and it's because they have an uncanny ability to recognize patterns and to be able to connect the dots. Mm-hmm. So around the time that this Gawker article came out, while Ross was still running the Silk Road in June of 2011, Deryagan starts to notice these packages. And over the course of the next several months, he begins to open them up. So Deryagan, having discovered the Silk Road, begins digging further. This is from a court transcript that he read all he could find online, and discovered that it became known through an online user by the username of Silk Road on bitcointalk.org.
What was the username?
The username was Silk Road. Okay. Now, bitcointalk.org was one of several websites that was run at that time for people that wanted to use Bitcoin. Now, you couldn't just use Bitcoin anywhere, and while more places are accepting cryptocurrency now, in 2011 and 2012, nobody did.
In fact, the Silk Road was one of the first adopters of Bitcoin.
Absolutely. And
is credited with growing it.
Yeah.
Or at least having a hand in growing it.
They took Bitcoin from being worth about 50 cents a coin whenever it first started to several $100 because the value of Bitcoin was based not in gold, which was the standard for several countries for the longest time, but in how much Bitcoin you were willing to pay versus the street value of the items that you were trying to purchase.
Mm-hmm.
And so this decentralized currency began to continue to rise and rise and rise in value because of the way in which the market was set for it. Now, if we continue on and looking at Duryagin in particular, Duryagin realizes that the Silk Road is only accessible through Tor, which was the onion router. That's what Tor stands for, and is a way in which a person can surf the web anonymously, or mostly. But an ordinary website with information about how to use Tor and access the Silk Road is something that he stumbled upon. When he looked to see who the website was registered with, Duryagin found the name and address of his first lead. However, the information was a fake and didn't show up on any public or law enforcement databases.
It was registered to one of the Bart Simpson.
Yeah, just like somebody,
a fake name.
Yeah, somebody that's completely fake, a shell name, a shell company, something that we're all kind of familiar with. So he goes to a URL called the silkroadmarket.org, which was registered to xta.net. And then he found a subpoena for xta.net that was registered to Mutum Siligum, a company owned and operated by a man named Mark Karpelès. And Karpelès is Karpelles. Now, I don't know if that's the proper way to pronounce it, because Karpelès is a really interesting figure. Mark Karpelès is a Frenchman who is living and doing business over in Japan. The other interesting thing about Karpelès, as it relates to Ross, is that Karpelès is running the major Bitcoin exchange site at this time. Now, if we roll back and remember back to how the exchange happened, according to the Forbes article, it's that the person who became the admin of the Silk Road, now known at this point as DPR, approached Ross because Ross had a security issue with his Bitcoin wallet. Who better to be able to fix the security issue with the Bitcoin wallet than the man who is running the largest Bitcoin exchange on the web and in the world at the time?
Mm-hmm.
So Duryagin focuses now his investigation on Mark Karpelès. And what he finds is that Karpelès probably, one, does not have all his eggs in one basket, and two, is becoming insanely profitable because of the Silk Road. Now, this doesn't implicate him in any way as being part of the Silk Road at this point, but what it does in the purview of the investigation of Duryagin is to say that what Karpelès is doing is bringing him profits because every little bit of Bitcoin that's exchanged through his site puts money in the bank for him. So it would make sense that he would have an interest in the things going on in the Silk Road and in making sure that those exchanges were secure. Mm-hmm. Because if Bitcoin becomes an unsecure currency and people's wallets are being completely emptied out, then they're going to stop using Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Not only would it mean the death of the Silk Road, but
possibly Bitcoin.
Karpelès' number one client is going to disappear, being the Silk Road in a certain point of view.
Yeah.
Right? So Karpelès was the owner of Mt. Gox, G-O-X, which, if said with a French accent, is Mongol, which just sounds like grunts. But Mt. Gox was the only major Bitcoin exchange market at the time. So Karpelès also owned and operated and administered hundreds of websites. So many websites that it was difficult for the Homeland Security officers to be able to track down each and every one of them. And he was a self-proclaimed computer hacker. Now, he had experience as a computer programmer. He specialized in Bitcoin and the development of e-commerce websites. Now, because of this really makes Karpelès a very well-suited operator for a site such as the Silk Road. So Duryagin unearths all of this stuff. And now Karpeles becomes the main focus of his investigation and his associates. So he learned that Karpeles had acquired Mt. Gox around the time that the Silk Road had started, and Karpeles had a strong motive to create a large underground marketplace where bitcoins would be in high demand. Again, the higher demand bitcoins are in, the more that they're being exchanged for, the more he is able to do this. So the Silk Road was uniquely suited to his purposes because there are few legitimate vendors who accept Bitcoin as payment, and it is widely believed that the rise of Bitcoin has been driven in large part by the use of the Silk Road. Now, that is taken from Jared Duryagin's affidavit in support of a search warrant for Mark Karpeles, and that is in an appendix. So that quote right there that we just had was from Duryagin himself. It is in the public record, and it is the reason in which he set out to gain a warrant to be able to search the assets of Mark Karpeles.
So at the moment, Ross Ulbricht is not on Duryagin's radar.
At the moment, Ross Ulbricht is not on Duryagin's radar, and according to the public record, Ross Ulbricht is no longer in control of the Silk Road. Mm-hmm. Because Duryagin did this investigation, started finding packages back in 2011 when Ulbricht was in control of it, the investigation doesn't start until someone else has been handed those things. So for 5 months, essentially, minimum, he's acquiring packages, doing research. He makes over 50 purchases on the Silk Road that they're able to capture through Chicago so that he can verify that this is what's actually happening. It even says that he tests the drugs and that the drugs are of not just quality, but extreme quality. That these are boutique versions of heroin, cocaine, and marijuana. Mm-hmm. That they're not only incredibly rare strands, but they're also things that are of the highest level. And so the DEA now becomes involved because they have an interest in what's happening with the drug exchange in the United States.
It's in the first word of their name.
Right. Drug.
Yeah.
So as this begins to happen, the investigation starts to roll. Ulbricht has transferred the usage of the site over to someone anonymous who's now going by the name the Dread Pirate Roberts. And as Karpeles is a key suspect, Duryagin's investigation continues. So Duryagin also managed to turn a confidential informant against Karpeles, who had worked for him for 2 years. Now, this informant revealed that Karpeles owned and operated BitcoinTalk.org. Now, if you remember, BitcoinTalk.org is the site in which Duryagin first gets his exposure to the Silk Road, where he finds out where, as we mentioned in the last episode, that door to Diagon Alley exists. That's where he's pointed to the door and where he is able to walk through it. It's the same discussion forum where Silk Road was first publicized. From visiting the forum, Duryagin knew, this is another quote from him, that it operated on a software platform known as Simple Machines. That this was the same software platform that was used to operate the discussion forums included on the Silk Road. The Simple Machines forum software was not widely used by forum administrators. Thus, the fact that the software was used to operate both the discussion forum on BitcoinTalk.org and the Silk Road indicates that the forums were likely set up by the same administrator. Now, that connection that Karpeles is making, if they're set up by the same administrator, that same administrator, or that Duryagin is making, that same administrator is Mark Karpeles, which puts him in the crosshairs of Homeland Security, the Chicago office. Now, we're making sure to reiterate that this is coming from the Chicago office for a very specific reason that's going to come up, and that is that there are a lot of government agencies, when a case like this comes down, that want the publicity. Mm-hmm. They want to be the organization that got the guy.
They want the caller, which I believe is what they call it.
Right.
They want to be the ones that bring in the bad guy, and they get the credit.
Absolutely. I mean, how many shows have we seen, whether it's...
Every show.
Yeah, NCIS,
where it's a sheriff's office, and then the
yeah.
FBI shows up, and they say, it's our crime scene now. They get out of jurisdiction pretty quickly, because there's a fight for who gets the caller.
Absolutely. And so...
we see that play out here.
And so the Chicago office is who opens this investigation.
And this is the Homeland Security.
The Homeland Security. Office. So this is actually, if you were to put an acronym on this is ICE.
Okay.
right? Oftentimes we think of ICE as dealing purely with immigration. They deal with trafficking. Trafficking is the number one concern of ICE. Now, whether that's human trafficking, drug trafficking, all of those things, ICE is at the forefront of all of that stuff.
So when we refer to Chicago, Homeland Security, ICE, not Carpelas, Duryagan,
yep,
they're one and the same, essentially.
They are all, one and the same, all coming together.
In context of this story.
So Duryagan's able to flip an informant. He finds out about the Simple Machines, which is running the forums, that the same basically background software that's used for Bitcoin.org is now what's being used for the Silk Road, because the face of the Silk Road begins to change. And this is one of the things that I think is really interesting, is that the forums and all of these things start to become more and more and more robust as implementation of things like Simple Machines is now running the infrastructure of the site. So as Duryagan connects the dots, he found another indication that looked something like Carpelas' involvement. There is a website called tuxtel.com, which, according to Duryagan, included a tutorial using a media wiki and a specific version of this software, the Simple Machines version 1.17. He also found that silkroadmarket.org and the Silk Road also contained pages constructed using the same version of the same software used to create the wiki page on tuxtel.com. So or tuxtelcom.com, because it's a telecommunications website. So he reviewed the wiki website and found that the media wiki software was regularly updated and many versions had been released over time. Thus, the fact that the exact same version of the software was used to create the wiki on Tuxtelcom, silkroad.org, and Silk Road indicates again that the same administrator was responsible for the creation of all three sites. Now, what we need to do is take a step back here.
And this administrator, the name is still Silk Road, right?
The administrator for the Silk Road is named Silk Road. Now, all of the rest of these have different administrators.
Right.
But there is something known as a digital fingerprint. Okay? And in talking to our friend Moss, who is a cybersecurity guru, one of the things that he, in our discussions, had talked to me about is the fact that each and every website that's created, there is a specific style in which it's done, right? Handwriting experts are able to look at the handwriting of a person and say, with good accuracy, whether or not the same person wrote two pieces, right? Likewise, a person who examines signatures and who's an authenticator can tell you, all right, this is Babe Ruth's signature from the 1940s or whenever. This is one that's closer to his death because the signature changes over time and those kind of things. Based on the vernacular that's used, the software that's used, and the style in which the coding lays out a certain and specific website, there's a fingerprint that's left there that a forensic analyst that does cybersecurity can look at and say with reasonable accuracy whether or not the same person is creating certain websites or whether or not it might be a protege of that person. For instance, if you taught me how to create a website, our styles would probably be similar enough to where it would point to, okay, it's probably one of these guys. And then by comparing the specific websites that you are known to have built and that I'm known to have built, they'd be able to see the stylistic differences and say, no, this was Lucas or this was Danley. But the initial examination is going to lead them back to somebody from a certain school of thought. If you watch Silicon Valley, the differences between whether you use tabs or spaces in your coding is going to be so specific to a certain coder that it's going to point them in a direction towards one person or away from another one.
There's very subtle things that can point at the author.
Right.
Yeah.
And so because of that, Duryagan was able to have in his mind and in the mind of all of the other investigators that all of these sites, Bitcoin Talk, Tuxtelcom, the Silk Road, the silkroadmarket.org, all have a similar administrator. The background software that's being used to run the infrastructure is very rare. It's not something that's openly used, and it's being used on all of these sites. The language, the vernacular, the type of coding, the style of coding is all being used on the same sites. And so all of this in Duryagan's investigation point him towards a French businessman living in Japan who owns Mt. Gox the only major Bitcoin exchange in the world at the time whose number one client is the Silk Road. In fact...
And that's Carpellis.
It is Carpellis. In fact, Carpellis had moved both the SilkRoadMarket.org, which he owned, and Tux Telecom, and reportedly and simultaneously to different IP addresses. So he's shifting them around in order that they are becoming harder and harder to trace. This showed that, according to Duryagan, Carpellis controlled the website and that he hosted them both at IP addresses that he controlled. So he's moving these sites from IP address to IP address. And as we discussed a little bit in the last episode, that's essentially all that a website is. Mm-hmm. And so to access the dark web as we know it is really just to access the direct IP address of a website. Mm-hmm. That there really is no such thing as the dark web. There's only the internet. Mm-hmm. And if you were to type in freeross.org and sign the petition that says that Ross's punishment is exceedingly aggressive and unusual for the crime, it would send you to that website. Likewise, if you were to get the actual IP address, a series of letters and numbers, it would also send you directly to that website. It's just a matter of how you get there. So by April of 2012, now, mind you, this is at this point 2 months after DPR has announced his new name on the Silk Road, and 5 months after, or 6 months after, Ross has turned the site over to this anonymous user who helped him sort out the Bitcoin wallet. Mm-hmm. Duryagan had identified multiple accounts belonging to Silk Road operators that contained Bitcoins worth millions of US dollars and linked them back to Carpellis and one of his associates. Now, his associate's name is Ashley Barr. Ashley Barr is Canadian. He is an operator, they believe, of the admin's accounts on the Silk Road. They discovered strong ties between those controlling the Bitcoin markets and those operating the Silk Road, and made several breakthroughs in identifying high-priority targets believed to be the backbone of the website. So Barr, who was a Canadian with a computer science degree, was Carpel's right-hand man, according to Duryagan, and that is according to the public record. So these are things that are stated in court. Duryagan says that Barr wrote like DPR and shared, quote, the same viewpoints. Duryagan, in his mind, was able to quickly link these two together.
So Duryagan believes that Barr is DPR at this point.
Duryagan believes that DPR is several people. Mm-hmm. But he believes that Barr is one of the users.
Based off of, like you said, the writing style, the viewpoints, the ideology that Ross held initially when starting the site. So
it shifts. There's a shift in ideology somewhere at the end of November of 2011 that we see carried through. There's much more emphasis put on sort of the illegal trafficking of things versus the open and free market. Mm-hmm. Because as we said before, there were home goods that were sold on the Silk Road. There were exotic pets that were sold on the Silk Road. Things that would have been legal to own, like snakes and things like that.
Tigers.
I don't know. I'm not. I haven't investigated to a point where I can say that, but it wouldn't.
I'm opening a rabbit trail into Joe Exotic, and we're going to shut that and keep talking.
So, but those are the types of things that could be exchanged. But likewise, like home goods, right? Mm-hmm. If you had an estate sale and wanted to get rid of some stuff, you could throw those things up on the Silk Road as an easy way to get rid of them. And those were the kind of things that popped up. People were buying musical instruments. People were mm-hmm. buying pots and pans. People were buying linens and things like that they had personally made. It was, in essence, one of the predecessors to something like Etsy, mm-hmm. where people are creating things on their own. They have a creativity and they're wanting to share it with people. And so the Silk Road was an easy marketplace for them to go to. And that's what happened. Now, there's this shift that happens after this person, DPR, takes control of the site in November of 2011 to more unsavory things. Mm-hmm. And Duryagan...
Which is where the money is.
Well, absolutely. Mm-hmm. And so for Duryagan, some things began to click. He believes that Karpeles was the mastermind behind the Silk Road, behind keeping it secure and operating it, and Barr was the voice of DPR. Jurgen says, "We're going right for the admin and his money," he wrote on April 20th in an email. In an interview years later, though, Karpeles admitted that a third to half of the transactions on Mt. Gox were linked to the Silk Road. So this is the lion's share. To put this in perspective, if you think about the cell phone market, Apple owns 1/3 of the cell phone market. Now, Android owns the majority of the others, but within Android, you have a bunch of competing factions. Everything with Apple comes from Apple. You use an iPhone that's made by Apple. You use an iOS that's made by Apple. You use products that are bought and sold on the Apple marketplace. Now, if you buy an Android, you can get a Samsung Android, or a Motorola Android, or an LG Android, or any number of various other brands that use Android, which is an open source system. So because of that, even though Android controls, from an iOS standpoint, an operating system standpoint, the majority of the cell phone users, the lion's share of the cell phone market is actually owned by Apple, because everything with Apple is proprietary, and everything with Android is open. So in that same way, while half to 2/3 of Mt. Gox are being used in Bitcoin by these other things, if the Silk Road were to go down, Mt. Gox would take an enormous hit, and it might not be sustainable. Likewise, if the cell phone industry lost Apple, there would be an absolute panic, because 1/3 of the market would immediately go down. You're looking at, if you were to take the population of the United States, going from 300 million cell phone users to 200 million. So 1 in 3 people now who have a cell phone would completely be affected or be out of touch. Matter of fact, most of the people I know would no longer be able to communicate with one another if, for whatever reason, Apple phones went down. So likewise, that's the thing. That's what we're looking at. It is a sizable chunk of the business there, enough that if something happened to the Silk Road, Mt. Gox is probably done. So on July 6th of 2012, Jurgen summarized his findings and submits them in a report that could be seen by every Homeland Security office and their coordinating office, known as C3. Now remember, this is happening in Chicago. So a few days after Jurgen submits this report, Michael McFarland, lead investigator at Baltimore Homeland Security, he's the lead investigator on the Silk Road operation at Baltimore's Homeland Security, because they've begun to investigate things too. He submitted and drafted a proposal to C3, which is the Homeland Security Investigation Headquarters, in which he told them that he was the point of contact for all domestic Silk Road-related investigations.
So now starts the conflict between Baltimore and Chicago. Jurgen and McFarland.
So Jurgen looks at this, and what he finds when McFarland submits this. Now, Baltimore, because of its proximity to both New York and Washington, D.C., is a much more tied-in branch than Chicago. Chicago represents a larger market than Baltimore, but the guys in Baltimore do a lot more with the two major offices in Washington, D.C. and New York City. And so because of that, McFarland has a lot more clout on the East Coast, and there is certainly an East Coast bias in all of our acronym government investigation agencies, right? If the people in Langley, Virginia...
Yes, I go in depth on that.
Yeah, if the people in Langley, Virginia want to be the head on an FBI investigation,
they're
going to take it from the Dallas FBI office.
Right.
Because proximity to Washington, D.C., because it's Langley.
I get
exactly.
it. I get what you're saying.
So the East Coast bias there is simply that because there are so many of the offices of the three-letter agencies are helmed out of the East Coast, they have an easier way of communicating with each other. They get a preference over those in the Midwest, those in the South, and even those on the West Coast. As we'll see, that Ross is ripped from San Francisco and taken to New York to stand trial at the end of all of this. So this
is fascinating
power
so far,
struggle,
by the way,
between Duryagan and McFarland starts up because McFarland wants to be the lead. Now, what happens in this is that Duryagan looks at the report that was made to the Homeland Security head office, and he realizes that McFarland has nothing. Mm-hmm. He's the lead investigator, but he has essentially done no work at all or I say no work at all. He's made no headway. Meanwhile,
he hasn't submitted anything.
Right. Duryagan and his staff have been able to track down not just who they believe was the mastermind behind running the Silk Road at this point, Mark Karpeles, but also they believe that they've tracked down his primary admin in his Canadian friend, Ashley Barr. They're able to link all of these different sites together, bitcointalk.org, silkroadmarket.org, tuxtelecom.com, and the Silk Road itself, all back to the digital footprint. And Mt. Gox, all back to the digital footprint that is created by a specific user, which seems to be, and all evidence is pointing towards, Mark Karpeles. So, as McFarland is trying to be the primary point of contact, Duryagan rewrote the draft to state that he was the primary point of contact and pitched his case as the only Silk Road investigation that HSI has and wanted their support.
He's that kid in class that's looking over your shoulder to get a good grade.
Yeah, exactly. That's you're conflating that with McFarland?
Yeah.
Oh, certainly.
Yeah.
So looking into it, C3 found that Duryagan had a much longer and diverse investigation on the Silk Road and called Duryagan to a meeting to brief them on it. At the meeting, Duryagan told them that he'd tracked down the Silk Road administrator, Mark Karpeles, and unbeknownst to Duryagan, McFarland intended to co-opt his investigation into Karpeles and had informed C3 of these plans to travel to a foreign country to interview him. Now let's stop there. Because Duryagan made every bit of this public inside the Homeland Security offices
with C3,
McFarland can look into his investigation and see absolutely every piece of it. Now, because of that, he knows all about Karpeles and he knows all about Barr. And so McFarland's plan is to travel to a foreign country and confront Mark, and I know I've called him Karpeles and Karpeles, right?
Yeah.
But his plan is to go and confront Mark Karpeles. So in early August, Duryagan writes to McFarland. Now remember, this is August of 2012. Duryagan wrote to McFarland outlining the large list of information leading him to Karpeles and Barr as the ones behind the Silk Road and DPR. Because Duryagan knew that pursuing Karpeles and Barr without tipping them off would be extremely difficult, he told McFarland, quote, not to share the information with the rest of his task force. And he didn't want anyone reaching out to Karpeles because he was, quote, worried that if someone did something that Karpeles might find out. He warned McFarland that Karpeles was, quote, closely monitoring all of his websites, which, quote, appeared to be fronts that he is, quote, actively tracking. And, quote, if someone went on and wasn't sufficiently disguised, then Karpeles might recognize it as law enforcement and would tip him off. Duryagan doesn't want to alert Karpeles that he's being investigated at all because if he finds out he's being investigated, he's going to jump ship.
Right. Like he's somebody that owns a cybersecurity, or not cybersecurity, the cyber commerce company. He's able to disappear if he needs to.
He's a computer programmer. He's a self-proclaimed hacker.
Yep.
He's running the largest Bitcoin exchange in the world. Absolutely everything that Mark Karpeles is doing says that this is a guy that's savvy enough to realize if you're not careful that they're being watched. He's already moving the IP addresses of the websites as they are so that they're becoming more and more difficult to trace.
Mm-hmm.
As that's happening, right, he's closely monitoring everything to make sure that he is not being discovered by government agencies, because he has to know that what he's doing is being looked at by these agencies. He's not an idiot.
And McFarland is booking a flight on American Airlines to go talk to him.
Essentially, that seems like that's what's happening.
No, I'm taking a humorous approach to it, but that's...
But he is taking the very bullheaded, like, he he is a Homeland Security agent, and people are going to cooperate with him because he's a Homeland Security agent.
Yep.
He's taking on the bully law enforcement persona that so many of us have come to.
He wants to go confront Karpeles.
Yes. And Karpeles is going to bend to his will because he's a Homeland Security agent. It's not really what happens. I'll continue on. A few weeks later, C3 called both Homeland Security Chicago and Homeland Security Baltimore to a meeting to settle this turf war between them. After each side presented its case, Deborah Note, one of the managers overseeing the meeting, noted that there was confusion and an odd approach to the Homeland Security Investigation Baltimore investigation. McFarland. She asked Duryagan if McFarland's investigation was, quote, interfering with his case, and he expressed, quote, deep concern for McFarland's tactics and the lack of focus in his investigation. However, by the end of September 2012, a new agency, Baltimore's DEA, so the Drug Enforcement Agency, which we had alluded to earlier, had gotten involved with the Silk Road investigation. Duryagan pulled up records, and they found out that they mirrored his exactly. So, what's happened in this is that Homeland Security has been given this open book into Duryagan's investigation. And McFarland is trying to be the lead on it. Right now, he's losing. As Deborah Note, who's one of the managers, has said, that he is losing that battle. And so what Duryagan claims that McFarland did is that he took the information that was open to all the Homeland Security offices and handed it over to the Baltimore DEA. So that the Baltimore DEA...
Was the DEA or the ADA?
No, the DEA.
Okay.
So that the DEA would be able to show Homeland Security that they had a file that looked exactly like Duryagan's. So that Duryagan's information, that his investigation was not unique to the Chicago branch, but was open. McFarland is using this as a ploy so that Baltimore DEA...
So he can bring him in.
And Baltimore Homeland Security can work on this together, which makes a lot more sense than having the Chicago branch run the investigation. Upset, Duryagan asked McFarland if he shared his investigation with the DEA and the rest of the Baltimore task force. McFarland said that he felt like... so here we go. McFarland said he had. Boom. So that's where Baltimore DEA got their information. That's where the task force got their information, because McFarland, going against the wishes not just of Duryagan, but also of Homeland Security, shared this information with the DEA. Having disregarded Duryagan's request not to, Duryagan expressed serious concern, but he was brushed off. The following day, Stephen Snyder, Homeland Security Baltimore's certified undercover agent, or CUC, program manager, told Duryagan that McFarland was once again trying to monopolize the Silk Road investigation. So Baltimore Homeland Security is going to Duryagan saying, look, McFarland is trying to monopolize this. This time by registering it in Baltimore's CUC program. So now what McFarland is trying to do is to make sure that Baltimore's certified undercover group is the one that's now in charge of infiltrating the Silk Road. So he's brought the DEA on board. Now he's going after the clandestine agents to make sure that Duryagan is blocked at every road. However, Snyder refused to allow this because, quote, it was clear to him that McFarland was copying Duryagan's case and there could only be one CUC program over the target website. So the CUC program can only be handled by either Baltimore or Chicago. Yet within a few weeks, Snyder reversed his decision and approved McFarland as the sole investigator, even though McFarland had been dropped by C3 and the CUC program the previous month.
Interesting.
So even though he had been denied by C3 and CUC, Snyder eventually relents. McFarland gets that, and at that point, McFarland began demanding Duryagan's information on Karpeles, saying that they were trying to work with him. Duryagan refused because he didn't want Karpeles to know of the independent investigation from Homeland Security Chicago. By October, though, Duryagan discovered that McFarland had shared all of HSI Chicago's information on Karpeles with members of his own task force, including an IRS agent, a DEA agent, and Secret Service agent. Further, McFarland had issued multiple subpoenas and had actively worked Karpeles to include a type of surveillance, all without Deryagin's knowledge. So at this point, he's not even working with Deryagin. He's going completely behind his back in order to set up an investigation. Now, this is where the story about Ross Ulbricht and the Dread Pirate Roberts starts to get really, really convoluted. If all of this wasn't difficult enough to follow, what happens next is one of probably the biggest misrepresentations of justice that's happened in maybe the last 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
The DEA agents, the IRS agents, the Secret Service agents that now know about the Silk Road, have all of the information from Deryagin, start to go rogue. Not only that, they gain admin privileges so that anything that happens on the Silk Road can be altered in real time to do and say anything that they want it to. And as these clandestine undercover agents discover the money pot that they have found themselves in, not only will they be investigated and sent to prison, but it's alleged that they will change so much information that it points to the conviction of Ross Ulbricht, makes him the sole proprietor of DPR, and more than that, it will allow the two key components of Deryagin's investigation, Mark Karpeles and Ashley Barr, to go free. That's next time on the Rev and Rep Investigates, the untold story of Ross Ulbricht, the Dread Pirate Roberts, and the Silk Road.
Please stop. You are hurting me. Please stop. You know what you're saying isn't true. You're hurting me, and you're hurting my family.